Sounds good.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our multi-heart lecture series. It's a great pleasure to have today Dr. Sneha Shah Jain, who will be talking about the responsible evaluation and deployment of AI in cardiology. She started as a clinical assistant professor of medicine at Stanford. She's currently a clinical assistant professor of medicine at Stanford University, and her clinical focus is general and preventive cardiology, and she also has a research focus on the development and evaluation of AI tools for cardiovascular health and clinical trials. She received her BS in economics from Duke University and her MD from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and then further she continued training with an MBA from Harvard Business School. She completed internal medicine residency training at Columbia New York Presbyterian here in New York, and then a fellowship in cardiovascular medicine at Stanford University prior to joining faculty where she currently practices. From a research and operations perspective, she works with the Stanford Center for Clinical Research and the data science team at Stanford to build, prospectively evaluate, and responsibly deploy AI solutions across the healthcare enterprise. It's a great honor to have you here today. Sorry if I mispronounce your name.
That's okay. That's okay. It's Sneha Jain, but it's such an honor to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
No problem. Thank you for being here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining me. I'm very excited to speak with you today about the responsible evaluation and deployment of AI in cardiology. And as mentioned, I wear three hats. I'm first and foremost a clinician. I'm also a research investigator, and I work with our technology and digital services team on the operations side to actually deploy these tools in our healthcare setting to reach patients and to impact clinical care. And so I want to talk a little bit about the fact that while there's so much excitement and possibility with AI, what do we need to actually responsibly and effectively deploy this technology in healthcare? Here are my disclosures, consulting and research support that are not relevant for today's talk. So today I hope to do three things. One, talk about where we are, the current health AI landscape, talk about where we need to go, what's needed for responsible AI deployment, and third, how we can do it. And I want to go through 4 examples that my team and I are currently working on regarding AI-augmented cardiovascular care, highlighting different lessons learned from each of them. And to start, I want to ground you in this really simple framework. And this is what we can use to think about what's required for successful and high-value health AI use. At its core, we need to build or buy really good, useful, relevant models that solve true needs. Then we need appropriate evaluation that allows us to first define and then verify the benefits we expect to achieve from deploying these tools. And this evaluation spans not only outcomes, of course, but also financial impact and ethical impact. And this requires us to think not only about the AI tool itself, but the program or workflow in which it lives to actually derive value. And then finally, we need responsible deployment and monitoring with an eye towards patient safety, effectiveness, health equity, and financial sustainability. Now, that top blue box is where the field has spent most of its time. How do we come up with really wonderful new AI tools? This figure is from a 2-part series that we published in JACC a few months ago, reviewing the field to date. And it's a fairly comprehensive review of the key studies in the field of cardiovascular AI so far. We discuss AI models built on a variety of different modalities, some of which you see on the screen, and others including genetics, multiomics, and electronic health record data. The AI tools described and shown on this page include innovations that span from image acquisition to better interpretation to detecting disease that normally is not assessed using that given modality. Take, for example, diagnosing a vast array of structural heart diseases, including valvular disease, just from a 12-lead ECG, and sometimes even a 1-lead ECG. In part 2 of this analysis, we explore multimodal inputs. That means taking and combining different types of data with the goal of generating accurate predictions at the level of the patient instead of the level of a specific study. And of course, we also discuss current work in generative AI. And what's amazing is that despite this being published only a few months ago, it's already out of date. There have already been advances in the field that were not captured in these studies because they hadn't happened yet. And really, any review of AI, any paper in AI is out of date by the time it's published because of this reason. So this is a graph put together by Timothy Keys, who works in the data science team with me, and shows that especially over the last decade, there has been a significant increase in the number of papers about artificial intelligence or machine learning. As of 2024, 1 in every 25 papers was about AI. That means there were over 58,000 papers published last year about AI. And of course, while not all of these papers are detailing a new AI tool or a new healthcare solution, we are seeing a boom in AI tools that are available across a variety of different avenues and modalities. Not only is there an increase in publication, but there's also a similar increase in the number of FDA authorizations of AI and machine learning enabled medical devices. This number was north of 950 as of August of this year. And the dip you see at the end near 2024 is only reflected that the data stopped in August of 2024. If it was through December, it would be even higher. So every time there's a lot of excitement about a new technology or a new solution, there's a risk that we put too much energy in focusing on what the tool can do instead of what we need the tool to do. In other words, we lose sight sometimes of the true problems that need to be solved and instead try to retrofit cool new technologies to the problem at hand. And this is why we see kind of a drop off in the number of AI tools that have been created versus how many are successfully deployed and impacting patients and providers. The numbers that are actually deployed are very, very low. They're getting larger and larger each day, but this is where that gap is, the gap between AI creation and AI tool generation to applying it to the right problems, for starting with the right problems and creating workflows around the tools to actually impact care. Much of the focus of the field to date has been on developing and evaluating the tool itself. Journals and companies are all focused on, does the model do what it says it does in a variety of different contexts? So training the model usually happens at a single institution, and then it is tested at that institution on data set that is held out. So there's no contamination between the data that's used to train and the data that's used to test. And then there's often external validation at a few other sites. Model performance to date has really focused on, does the model do what it says it does in a variety of these different data sets? And are there similar performance across certain subgroups, specifically racial subgroups or sex-based subgroups? And while this is important, this is only part of the story. The true impact of a model is dependent on so much more than just the model itself. That's just the top box in this graph. And this is from a paper that we put out recently this month. And so this figure outlines how AI-guided care is an interplay of the model's output, of the practice guidelines we have based on what actions we can take. So take, for example, an ECG model that predicts structural heart disease. We have guidelines around which types of structural heart disease there's actually actionable steps to take. And then importantly, the capacity to do the work. If there are shortages in certain areas of providers who can provide the action that's necessitated from an output from a model, let's say getting someone a TAVR, then we run into challenges where we won't see the true benefit if we can't follow through on the actions that the AI model would incentivize us to act upon. So there is more work being done here, and I want to show you a little bit of what we've come up with at Stanford with the data science team to think through this entire ecosystem to understand value, not just the model, but also the implementation of the workflow or the program itself. And this includes both pre-deployment simulations of presumed benefits and post-deployment monitoring. So this is called FIRM, the Fair, Useful, Reliable Model Evaluation, and it has 3 stages. And these stages help us decide which AI tools to deploy and which ones are worth implementing at scale at our hospital. So stage 1 is all about what and why. What is this problem that AI is supposed to solve in this particular context? What's the output of the model and what is it going to be used for? What will the impact of this model be on patients, clinicians, and the overall health system? And we look at this not only in terms of clinical impact, which is of course fundamental and important, but also what's the financial impact? Are we creating something that's sustainable? What's the cost to run? What's the cost to follow the prediction? And what are the revenues that come back to the hospital? And is it something that can sustain itself? And then critically, an ethical and equity lens. What are the unintended consequences of deploying this model? What do we need to build into our workflow as safeguards to protect patients and providers when we deploy this tool? This is a critical first step we take really when we look at any AI solution that we're deploying. Step 2 is how. Where do you deploy the model? In which workflow? How do we test it? What are the background kind of technological solutions and support we need in order to do this smoothly? And then finally, impact. How do we prospectively evaluate and confirm what we predicted to be the benefit is actually what we see? How do we make sure that we are monitoring the tool over time to make sure there isn't something like model drift, where the model's performance changes over the time based on a differing baseline population or differing function of the tool itself? And then importantly, given the speed of AI development, it is likely that a new tool will come out very quickly, or an update to an existing tool will come out very quickly. How do we make sure we're very seamlessly integrating these updates while also ensuring continued safety and high performance of the entire AI augmented program? So this is our approach. And I think if we zoom out, so this was a very health-centered kind of approach that we're using for the firm assessment. But when we zoom out, it's really fascinating to think about the financial implications of health AI as a whole on the healthcare system. And this was a really fun paper that I had the opportunity to write with some unique co-authors. So Morgan Cheatham is a vice president at the venture capital firm Bessemer Venture Partners. Michael Pfeffer in the top right is Stanford's chief information officer. Linda Hoff is Stanford's chief financial officer. And Nigam Shah in the bottom right is one of my mentors and our chief data science officer. So we brought these people together who don't spend their time usually writing papers, except Nigam, of course, and ask the question, what's the financial implications of health AI on a whole? And what we found through our research is that there's so much misalignment right now between what regulators want versus what the people who decide reimbursement want, and the incentives that are being created based on these different groups are leading us to an environment where we are headed for a way where AI vendors are incentivized to use payment models that risk driving up the total cost of care without necessarily improving outcomes. And this is because one topic, which we already talked about, which is evaluation frameworks today focus on, does the AI model work? Not really, does it create value? Also, hospitals are incentivized, and really everyone, insurance companies, hospitals, everyone in the ecosystem is incentivized to prioritize financial benefit over potential clinical benefit. And the third is that the pricing strategies that AI vendors have developed and are using currently fall in line with the ways we pay for healthcare in the US today, largely fee for service and only a little bit of value-based care. And so we have a few potential paths forward that we document in this paper and focus on those robust pre and post deployment assessments of AI impact, that being necessity, something that we have to do no matter what, creating transparent and shared evaluation frameworks across divisions and not just relying on the current market forces that would move us towards more financially driven decisions instead of clinical high impact decisions. And then aligning the way business models are developed with the way AI needs to be implemented. And when I talk about business models, what am I talking about here? So a business model is the way that companies or organizations think about creating value and how they capture value themselves, how they make money. And if we can align the way that AI vendors and healthcare systems win with how patients win, we are on a path towards a more sustainable future for health AI. Okay. So zooming back in to the hospital system when we're thinking about health AI deployment, if we are to break up this simple model into something that has a little more detail and a little more parts, it would look something like this. And this is from part 2 of our review in JAC earlier last year. And The exact components of these steps might vary depending on where you are, but what I really want to highlight today is a concept we've already alluded to, which is that this process of AI development, evaluation, and deployment has to be iterative. We have to think about the realities of deployment and capacity constraint when we're designing and thinking about which useful tools, the AI tools to deploy. And we have to think about monitoring and evaluating models over time. Now, this is not even to mention that the underlying technology, like we said, as it gets better, we need to incorporate this seamlessly into our process of evaluation and monitoring. Now, we have to get back to the core. First, we have to ask, what is the job to be done in healthcare? And we need to deeply understand the needs and pain points of systems if we are to deploy the right AI tools to create the most value for our patients, providers, and health systems. It's easy to get excited about new technology and what this technology can do instead of the problems that need to be solved. So on the screen is Clay Christensen. He wrote the book Innovator's Dilemma, and he really highlighted why some technologies, why some companies fail, even when they're offering the most cutting-edge, high-tech solutions. And a simple but key framework that he uses that I think about almost every day is jobs to be done. This is the idea that people, providers, companies, they don't just buy products and services, they really pull them into their lives to serve a certain need. It might not be a need that they were aware of, as in the case of the iPhone and Apple, but there are certain needs and pain points that drive what people are going to gravitate to as successful solutions. So we have to ask, what do stakeholders want? Again, they may or may not know that they want it, but what would they really want and what would benefit them? And how do we build or hire a product to do that? So what's the job to be done in health AI? This framework and thinking about needs first is why our data scientists work alongside clinicians. We hear patient perspectives. We reach out and talk to providers. We talk with our operational teams on the ground and at the front line to understand what their needs are. And this interdisciplinary perspective is, I think, critical to drive success in this area. And as is likely not surprising to many of you, one of the key jobs to be done in cardiovascular medicine, clinical cardiology, is really to find the right patient at the right time for the right prevention or early treatment, and understanding specifically the right patients where treatment at that moment would drive high value and high outcomes for them. There are what we call really actionable diagnoses, where if we had the diagnosis, if we knew who had the problem, we would be able to adjust the course of their life and their medicine and their treatment to live a more fulfilling life. So that's really where we have focused our work. So now I want to talk through 4 different projects around this realm. These are areas that we think are really high opportunity for that high value prevention or early treatment. Transthyretin amyloid cardiomyopathy, coronary artery calcium, peripheral artery disease, and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And we're going to talk about those 3 components. Not only does the model matter, but the workflow matter, and how we deploy and monitor over time matters. And you'll see different aspects of each of these 3 in the examples that are to come. So first, let's start with transthyretin amyloid cardiomyopathy. ATTR-CM is a progressive infiltrative cardiomyopathy, and it's caused by abnormal cardiac disposition of this misfolded TTR protein. This is a protein that's mostly secreted by the liver, and it's increasingly recognized, this cardiomyopathy is increasingly recognized as a common cause of heart failure, of both HFrEF, heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, and heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. And unfortunately, in the United States, ATTR-CM disproportionately affects Black or African American and Hispanic patients. Now, the initial signs of this disease are really quite nonspecific, and this leads to significant underdiagnosis of the early stages of this disease. And unfortunately, prior data has shown that this is particularly true in the Black and African American populations, where diagnosis happens usually when patients have progressed to more advanced phenotypes of the disease and experience worse outcomes than non-Black patients because of this late diagnosis. Historically, this disease has been associated with fairly high morbidity and mortality, and the median survival after diagnosis was only 3.5 years. However, the past few years have seen a boom in treatment options for ATTR-CM, and currently approved treatments stabilize the disease rather than reverting the disease, which just highlights how important early detection is so that we can get patients started on these disease-stopping therapies as soon as possible. Oops. Sorry about that. Skipped a few pages. Okay, so this led us to ask the question, how can we use AI to combat some potential bias in the diagnostic process? We know that Black and African American patients and Hispanic patients are less likely to be diagnosed. So we wanted to look at our healthcare system, and this is work that started back when I was a resident, so many years ago, with Pierre Elias and Tim Poderuca. And we took a look at patients with an ECG in our healthcare system, patients with a TTE, and patients with a PYP scan, and how patients flowed through the system. And what we saw is that the ethnic and racial background of these patients really dropped over time. So patients with an ECG, 43% were non-Hispanic white, with the remainder being Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black in a kind of very multi-center New York City type of population. Patients with a TTE, more of them were non-Hispanic white. And then patients who ended up progressing to get a PYP scan, 78% were non-Hispanic white. And only 22% were Hispanic or non-Hispanic Black. So this just confirmed some of our concerns regarding potential bias in the referral process for ATTR-CM. And so we had this opportunity to collaborate to build a convolutional neural network using inputs of ECG waveform data and echo images. And we started off using the structured data from echo images, so like the data that's in a report. Built a convolutional neural network to predict the probability of cardiac amyloid. And we tested this both at our institution and some external sites and found very high model accuracy. But I think the key is that we didn't stop there. We didn't think that was good enough. Okay, great. A model detects that someone has ATTR amyloid. But if we can't get that patient to the right provider to treatment, does it even matter? So we ended up performing a single-arm multi-center trial, and this was led by Tim Poderuca. And the results are to be presented very soon, but the main takeaways from this trial were that at the time of interim analysis, we had detected about 3 times the patients compared to our control. And about half of them belonged to ethnic and racial groups that were at risk for underdiagnosis. And of the patients who were sent to specialty care, so of those patients who were positive, they were all sent to specialty care, over 90% were started on tafamidis. Now, one question you could ask is like, okay, well, would these patients just have been diagnosed maybe a month later than your model? We looked at that. We went back to their data and tried to identify, okay, if we had been running this model, how soon would these patients have been picked up? It was over a year earlier. And many of these patients already had cardiologists, but they were being treated for kind of non-specific heart failure. So the patients picked up through this AI augmented program were truly patients who had access to healthcare, but were missed by the system. They were not being evaluated for amyloid. And I think that this shows some of the potential for AI augmented care. It's not necessarily about picking up, and it shouldn't be about picking people up that we are already good at identifying. We don't need help there. We need help in picking up the missed patients, the patients where our unfortunately biased healthcare system forgets and leaves behind. More to come here in the coming months. Next, to talk about coronary artery calcium. And I know you had a recent talk by Dr. Fatima Rodriguez, who's a close collaborator and mentor of mine. So we'll breeze through some of the background here, but what I really want to focus on is, okay, this group that I had, the pleasure of working with and contributing to has done some really incredible research around AI tools and deploying these AI tools. But what does it take to translate a research solution into a clinical solution? How do we deploy it clinically in a way that actually impacts a large number of patients instead of a very curated, specific group of patients in research? So to start, I'm sure this is common knowledge for many of you, but CAC has been found to be one of the most powerful, independent, non-invasive predictors of ASCVD, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And it's shown to discriminate much better than the pooled cohort equations, which we used previously, across diverse populations. And this has led to a lot of research from the CAC consortium surrounding the potential and the benefit of using CAC to the point where it is now in our guidelines. But despite this clinical value, only about 1 million CAC scans are done each year. And this is for a variety of factors, but one of which is that it's often not covered by insurance. So this led researchers to ask, can we use incidental coronary artery calcium that's found on non-gated CT scans done for some other reason? And is it helpful? And these researchers found, and there have been a number of studies in this area, they found that the prediction of MI and death can be done just as accurately with incidental coronary artery calcium as well as gated specific coronary artery calcium findings on CAC scans. And this is exciting because there are over 19 million non-gated CT scans performed annually. Again, that's compared to the 1 million CAC scans. But unfortunately, incidental CAC is not commonly evaluated or reported in our radiology reports. And so we did some studies at Stanford, and we found that patients who had non-gated chest CT scans were more likely to come from really diverse patient populations compared to those who had gated CT scans. These patients were more likely to be non-white, Hispanic, uninsured than those who received a gated CAC scan. So this made us think there is really an opportunity here. There's an opportunity for large-scale prevention of ASCVD in patients who are unaware of this risk. And I just want to say a huge shout out to my mentors who I've had the opportunity and chance to work with for the past 3 years on this work, David Marin, Alex Sandu, Fatima Rodriguez. This work really stemmed, I think, all the way back in 2018 when David Marin was using non-gated CT scans in his clinic with Alex Sandu as his fellow to identify patients who might be high risk, who can benefit from disease. And I share that only to say that some of the best research and the most exciting work can happen grounded in patient care, day-to-day patient care, and the insights that you have from those meetings. All right, so this slide highlights what we were just talking about, that even though we know this association between incidental coronary artery calcium and cardiovascular morbidity and mortality, only 31 to 44% of cases where there was incidental coronary artery calc present, only in 31 to 44% of cases was it reported by a radiologist. And this is data from 2024. So given all of this, we trained a model on CT scans from Stanford and the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis. We identified patients and we trained on about 341 patients. Stanford test had 42 and the Mesa test had 46 to perform CAC scoring on routine non-gated chest CT scans. I'm sure Fatima talked to you about all of this, so we won't go into too much detail here, but this was externally validated on a number of patients from 4 geographically disparate health systems. Now, this paper was published a year ago, and the model has since been updated multiple times over to perform even better across a wider variety of scans. We then went on to assess the association between deep learning CAC and ASCVD. This is work led by Allison Peng, one of my collaborators, who is now a fellow at Johns Hopkins, as well as Fatima Rodriguez. And we found that of 5,700 patients with ASCVD, about half had a DL-CAC score greater than 0, and about a third had a DL-CAC score greater than 100 Agatston units. So this is the same Agatston units you think of when you think about CAC scans. And so that matched up with an average 10-year ASCVD risk of 24%, but only a quarter of these patients with DL-CAC greater than 100 Agatston units, only a quarter were on statins. And after we adjusted for age, sex, labs, and comorbidities, the DL-CAC score was still associated with a hazard ratio of 1.57 of death, MI, and stroke compared with patients with a DL-CAC score of 0. Okay, then Alex Sandu in 2022 ran a prospective randomized quality improvement study at Stanford Healthcare to understand the impact of notifying clinicians and patients of the presence of incidental coronary artery calcium. And he showed that there are actually profound impacts. And what I want you to take from this slide is that it's really not just about the AI tool. The intervention here was really the notification. Patients were randomized to the notification arm, which included a letter that had a personalized image of their own plaque. And both patients as well as their providers received this note. It first went to providers, and they were offered the chance to opt out if they didn't want their patient to receive this notification. And if they said, yes, please send it, or if they didn't say anything, patients were notified 2 weeks later. And the primary outcome was statin initiation rates. And you see here that the notification arm led to 51.2% new statin prescriptions versus 6.9% in the usual care arm. And the really amazing thing is this has persisted. We've done an 18-month follow-up, and most of the patients, over 90%, who were started both in the notification arm and then 6 months later, we notified the people in the usual care arm, over 90% have stayed on statins, even 18 months out from intervention. So then this was looking at retrospective CT scans. So CT scans that had been done before and then the notification happened later. We wanted to see what would happen if we did this kind of intervention in real time. So this is a study that I'm co-leading with Ramsey Dudam, under the mentorship of Fatima, David, and Alex, to measure the rate of statin initiation at 6 months after notifying patients and clinicians about the presence of incidental CAC founded on non-gated CT scans in as close to real time as possible. It's not quite real time because of the way the data has to flow, but usually within a few days to a few weeks of their CT scan. We finished recruiting for this trial, and readout's going to happen in a couple of months. But there are some limitations to this research when we start thinking about clinical opportunities for DLCAC, and that's really what I want to focus on today. The main limitation is that many patients lack a Stanford PCP or cardiologist. Only about 20% of patients have their primary care at Stanford. And when I think about who Stanford patients are, I'm thinking about the number of people who get CT scans at Stanford. Ideally, we would be able to reach all of them if we're finding this finding on a CT scan done at our institution. But right now, we can only reach about 20% of them. And then because it was in the research context, it's really hard to do true real-time notification where we think the intervention might be as potent as possible. So the questions we had were, how can we reach a broader population? And can we provide this information to providers and patients at the time of their scan? So this has led us to develop the iCAC clinical program that has 3 parts to it. Step 1 is identifying coronary artery calcium with the AI algorithm, which we have already done. Evaluating appropriateness of providing follow-up care. So making sure that the patient isn't already on lipid-lowering therapy. There isn't some reason that they're not on it. They are not hospice or, really low benefit of having lipid-lowering therapy. And one of the exciting parts is that, this workflow, quote unquote, workflow piece of this is something that can be largely automated so that this is not a high burden to providers, which could be, it would just, a program would stop. It would not be able to go forward if the burden just adds to what a clinician has to do already. So some really exciting kind of AI augmentation here. And it honestly doesn't even need AI. It's just automated searches in the EMR. And then finally, a cardiology clinical pathway. And we have a few different pathways, including just the notification letter that patients can bring to their own provider, a preventive cardiology iCAC program that people can be enrolled in, or a one-time visit. So that's all ongoing work. We have a couple of pilots that we're exploring in a few different sites, both in an acute care setting with some emergency department partners, as well as more ambulatory settings. So we're excited to get that clinical work started. Next, I wanted to talk about peripheral artery disease. And here's where we've done a lot of the firm processes to guide our intervention. So why evaluate for PAD? Why is this an important need? Well, 70% of Americans aren't familiar with PAD and its risk. Despite PAD being highly prevalent, it can be detected by a non-invasive ABI test. So it's very easy to diagnose. It's not burdensome to patients or providers and doesn't have high risk. And PAD, it's not just about PAD. As everyone in this room knows, it's associated with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease in other beds and cardiovascular death. And finally, there have been some updates to the guidelines, and there are an incredible number of Class 1 guidelines that are available. And so the need is a way to diagnose ideally high-risk asymptomatic, but definitely symptomatic PAD earlier in the primary care population in order to increase the rate of necessary medical interventions early enough to prevent adverse outcomes. And I share this picture from the recent guidelines just to show how much is in green. There's so much that we can do for these patients if we knew how to find them. So this was the process we followed for the PAD AI augmented program development. We trained a PAD classifier using XGBoost to classify patients likely to have undiagnosed PAD from EMR inputs. This was over 1,000 EMR inputs. And we defined the cohort as about 4,899 PAD cases and 44,000 control patients, and trained this model based on over the 1,000 features that we discussed. And the accuracy was 0.93%, AUROC was 0.82. This was inspired by work led by Elsie Ross on the research side, but what was really fun was being able to train it on so much more data on the operational side. We made a brand new model that worked well in our Stanford ecosystem. Then we developed the workflow. Okay, someone gets flagged for PAD, then what? Who gets notified? Who ends up ordering the ABI test? How does that get paid for? What happens next? Do all patients see a vascular medicine specialist or some patients? And as you can imagine, this was an incredibly collaborative effort across vascular medicine, internal medicine, our technology solutions. And that kind of coming up with a solution together as an interdisciplinary group is so critical. That's what helps set up programs for success instead of a top-down approach saying, okay, now you must do this and participate in this program. And then finally, before clinical deployment, we completed a pre-implementation firm assessment. That's that stage one that we were discussing. We considered the financial impacts and we considered the ethical implications. And I'll highlight one of the key ethical implications in the next two slides. And I don't want to give you the impression that all of this is easy. And as soon as you come up with an AI tool and it makes sense and there's a need, it's going to be deployed. So I want to talk about some of the challenges we encountered and what we did to mitigate. So first, inconsistent clinical guidelines. PAD, if you look at the ACC/AHA guidelines, they suggest screening not just for symptomatic patients, but high-risk asymptomatic, people with coronary artery disease, people with diabetes. And even though some of these people might be on statins already, there's so much else that's green, class 1 indicated for PAD that these patients are likely not on. But the USPTF guidelines that primary care follows only suggest screening for symptomatic patients. And this led to a lot of discussion. And we decided to focus first on symptomatic patients because of the tension that existed between what PCPs were told that they should do and what vascular specialists were required to do. We were actually reaching a consensus of doing high-risk asymptomatic patients because of some kind of CME type education that our cardiovascular medicine specialists were providing. But then we ran into this problem, financial reimbursement. So this insight that we found ended up leading to this perspective that we published in the New England Journal of Medicine a couple of months ago. But we identified concerns regarding the potential healthcare costs to patients and the adequacy of insurance coverage for ABI testing specifically in this case, but really confirmatory diagnostic testing in general. So when an AI model says, even a validated AI model says, hey, this patient is high risk for XYZ disease, you still have to go confirm it with more traditional assessments as of now. So ABI tests, which cost a few hundreds of dollars often in healthcare settings, especially if you do both the Doppler and the blood pressure cuff, or other confirmatory tests for other diseases, might not be covered if the patient that's identified doesn't have traditional risk factors or traditional symptoms. Now think about this. The reason we're using AI is to be better than the way we currently are, which is just saying, okay, all people above this age with these specific disease states, they are high risk, so just screen all of them. We're trying to be more precise. We're trying to actually deliver precision medicine for patients. But our current insurance practices and our current guidelines don't support that. So what do we need to do from the standpoint of health systems? What's the responsibility of health systems and insurance companies to avoid financial toxicity? And so for now, given these findings, we ended up focusing on symptomatic patients because it is very easy to ensure that this gets covered. And then we also shortlisted relevant medical necessity codes aligned to guidelines in order to support prior authorization effects and applications in case we do move to more asymptomatic high-risk patients. And then finally, selecting the right patient population and minimizing PCP burden. The minimizing PCP burden is key. They have so much that they have to get through in 20 minutes. PAD is probably not high on their list of things to screen for. So this was our first foray into how do you actually do really personalized review of systems? I'm not sure how many people do a full review of system in their clinic. I would guess it's very, very, very few people, and especially in primary care, it's very hard to do that. So how do you find the right patients to ask very targeted review of systems questions to guide really high value and impact care for those populations? So this led us to this workflow. The model provides a prediction using patient data. We then ask patients if they're symptomatic by a two-question, extremely simple My Health questionnaire that they can fill out before their visit, or the MA can ask when they come for their primary care visit. If these patients are found to have symptoms that are consistent with PAD, an OPA, which is kind of like a BPA, a best practice alert, is sent to the PCP with one button. It's really, really two buttons saying, yes, send to vascular clinic, and then all of the other ordering for the ABI test and everything is done separately, or no, this patient is not appropriate. Then the referral to vascular clinic happens, and the patient is scheduled for an ABI with subsequent follow-up with vascular medicine, regardless of the ABI finding, to talk about next steps. All right. And now we come to our last HCM. And so for that example where we talked about the workflow, we are building the technology solutions to deploy that workflow now, and we are going to be prospectively evaluating in the months to come. All right, finally, the most recent project is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And here we're working with colleagues who have developed a hypertrophic cardiomyopathy model based on ECG data and echo imaging data, the actual DICOM image files. But we're trying to turn the problem on its head a bit. We're saying, based on this firm assessment, can we create target product profiles for AI models? And what I mean by that, this is TPPs are used in the pharma and device world to say, how well does a drug need to work to create value, both clinically and financially? We're asking the same thing of AI models. We're no longer having the bottleneck be the creation of AI models. There are many HCM models on the market today or in development. But what we wanted to say is understanding our workflows, our capacity constraints of the Echo Lab and of HCM Clinic and all of this, these other pieces to actually drive value. How well does a model need to work in order to create value for our system? What's the target product profile? What does this model need to do, and how well does it need to do it? And then based on that work, it's also clear that we need some solutions to solve capacity problems. For rare diseases, for inherited cardiomyopathies, there are not enough doctors. There are not enough specialists for these diseases to treat the number of people we're going to be finding. So we can't just cause the problem we can't stop by saying, okay, we're going to find all these people with HCM unless we are responsible with how these patients are actually going to get care long term, or continue to work towards trying to get these people care. So I couldn't end this talk without talking about some applications of generative AI. This work is led by Jack O'Sullivan, one of our fantastic fellows, and his mentor, Ewan Ashley. And we are collaborating on this work with Google. And this study really looks at how do we help this capacity problem. So they evaluated AMY, which is a specialized research LLM system, and using it to diagnose, triage, and manage patients with suspected inherited cardiomyopathies. We ended up comparing AMY's responses to the responses of board-certified general cardiologists when they were both given clinical data, and right now it's just clinical data from reports that would help support or dispute the likelihood of someone having hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So we compared AMY, we compared the board-certified cardiologist, and then we compared that to AMY plus cardiologist, where the cardiologist had access to the responses that AMY generated to a set of questions in relation to the clinical data. We found that in a blind comparison where we had specialists compare answers from the AMY assessment to the cardiologist assessment, the AMY assessments were preferred across half of the evaluation domains, and the evaluation domains were the evaluation criteria on the right-hand side, and they were equivalent across the remaining domains. But probably one of the most important findings was around the assistive potential of large language models in this context. So when general cardiologists had access to the large language model, AMY's assessment, the cardiologist response improved in 64% of cases, while reduced in quality in only 3% of cases. So there's this idea that maybe LLMs and cardiologists can complement each other pretty well in certain specific situations. And maybe we can start solving some downstream problems that can happen from better diagnosis, so we can get from better diagnosis to also better treatment. What I hope you see from all of these examples is that there are some incredible potentials for AI augmented cardiovascular care. But to get there, we have to think not only about the model, we have to also think about how we act on model output and keep in mind important pillars of evaluation that needs to happen regarding patient safety, clinical efficacy and effectiveness, equity and fairness, reliability and generalizability, and finally, financial sustainability and creating value. And so in summary, these are the 5 points I hope you take with you. 1, it takes more than just the AI tool itself to create value for health AI. We have to think about the programs and workflows we build around these tools to create value. We need to pick the right problems to solve, where AI leads to impactful action that actually drives meaningful clinical benefit. 3, we have to innovate around the workflow itself, and that might take iteration, and it definitely takes interdisciplinary collaboration and thinking. 4, we need pre and post-deployment assessments of true impact. We got to understand, even before we select which AI tools to deploy, which ones we think will have high clinical benefit while being financially sustainable and ethical and improving equity whenever possible. And finally, we have to think about implementation and monitoring plans from the beginning. How are we going to monitor tools that are deployed and building that into our design of the workflow and the tool itself? And with that, thank you so much for your time. I would love to acknowledge the teams that I have an opportunity to work with every day. On the left is the Stanford Healthcare Data Science team. This is an incredible group of not only clinicians, but ethicists, a couple lawyers, some, of course, data scientists and administrators. And being able to think in the same room with this group of people has been an incredible experience for me and has led to a lot of really amazing collaborations and initiative. The incidental coronary calcium team, as you see on the right, and in the middle is a gentleman named Doug. He is a patient, and he's been kind of a grounding voice and focus for our group around what matters to the patient and keeping that at the center of everything we do. And then also the Stanford Center for Clinical Research, as well as Stanford Medicine as a whole.
Thank you so much, Neha. That
Yes.
was amazing. Thank you so much. I really enjoy your lecture and congratulations for being in the forefront of this rapidly evolving field. If anyone has questions, please place the questions in the Q&A and we'll go through them. I'll start with a question. I mean, obviously we're very interested in all this and we are at Stanford and you guys are at the forefront of implementation and planning and research on this. How do you see this expanding to other sites or through the US? And it's obviously hard for hospitals to pay for licenses when they don't even know if this is going to lead to something. How do you see implementation could happen?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. It actually goes to work we're doing that I didn't present today in our Guide AI lab. And that work is saying, okay, we've created some of these tools for assessment and assurance, but they're kind of cumbersome. They take time, they take people. How do we streamline it so that it can be packaged and done as seamlessly as possible? And this is our work to create what we're calling a service right now and creating software that we can deploy to other health institutions, other places, so they can run these analyses fairly quickly and cost effectively and able to help guide their decision making around which AI tools to invest in. So ongoing work there. Also, some of the HCM AHA work is in collaboration with other institution and community hospitals. So we're working with these different learning collaboratives to say, okay, here's what we're doing at Stanford. Here's what we could do at academic institutions. Let's just distill what's most important. What can be done kind of outside of a healthcare system and how much needs to be validated locally so that we can think about cost-effective ways to do this. So to answer your question, ongoing work there.
Yeah, no, amazing. And do you think the patients could also be the ones deciding to sign in to services like this, or?
I think so. I think so. So this is there's an interesting initiative led by some folks on the pediatric side at Stanford called AI Voice. And they are trying to say, so there's this issue where when an AI model predicts something, it's usually predicting across a continuum. I'm talking about more standard traditional AI now, not generative AI. But someone has to pick a threshold. So like if we're predicting AI amyloid, you have to pick a threshold that any, prediction above 0.5 or above 0.7, we're going to say is positive for high risk. How do you set that threshold? Right now, it's researchers or operators or clinicians setting the threshold. But shouldn't patients maybe have a say in that as well? So this research is saying, okay, if we were to, how can we determine the right threshold that patients would want by giving them a variety of situations where, okay, here's the situation if this is a false positive versus a true positive, false negative versus a true negative, and which outcome would you pick to help guide that thresholding? And so there might be a world in the future where the threshold that's set is a mix of what clinicians want, what the guidelines want, what patients want.
Awesome. Thank you very much. We have a question from Joe Fontes from Lennox. He says, given that AI is mostly developed by startups, how does Stanford partner with them in regards to IRB process and approval? What are the typical timelines for project implementation, and how does Stanford protect patients' data? Great
Great
question.
question. So Stanford's a bit unique in that we build a lot of our models actually. So most of the models that I've shown you are ones that we have built, or we're collaborating with academic clinicians at other institutions who are building models. So that's a bit more streamlined. The one company we were working with, Bunker Hill Health, actually spun out of Stanford. So the model was developed at Stanford and then they spun out into a startup. That being said, there are really robust kind of privacy practices, BAA agreements, and all of these kind of patient protection agreements to think about what data is being sent out of the Stanford system. And I think Stanford prefers as much being run on behind our firewalls as possible. And then in terms of timeline, it's fluctuating. It's kind of been like a normal distribution almost, where initially it was pretty fast because nobody really understood what was happening with AI, so it was easier to get things done. Then there were a lot of processes that developed and things took more on the order of months, but now it's getting more efficient as we're thinking about like what have we already done, what do we need to, what privacy forms do we need to fill out, what do we need for the IRB. I also think what's interesting is how much of this work is research versus quality improvement. And I don't know if we've figured this out yet. If you are researching and developing a new tool to to identify maybe disease and act on disease that we haven't acted on before, so maybe like a new indication for a certain medicine, that's very clearly research. But what about when it's clinical decision support? That's not research. Finding the right patients where we know what to do. So finding severe AS from an ECG, we know what to do with severe AS. So that's actually QI. And those end up being a lot faster. So I think thinking and asking like what's really research versus QI can help that time component as well.
Thank you very much. It seems like at most institutions, we're going to need people like yourself specialized in this and in deployment implementation of these tools, right? So from Shivang Madan, he says, thanks for the great talk. Congratulations to the amazing work you're doing. Do you think it is reasonable to compare the responses by physicians and AI when we know that physicians are probably better at explaining the diagnosis to the patient and are not that good at writing up a description, which is what the large language models are designed to be better?
It's a good question. I think the goal for that study was to try to triage the number of patients who would get to an HCM specialist. So getting more patients, because unfortunately, regardless of whether a patient has HCM, if they show up in clinic, they take up a patient slot anyway. But if we were better at getting the right patients to the specialist, so that specialists are only seeing the people that could most benefit from their care, that was where like this assessment was happening. There have been some interesting studies on which who speaks to patients more empathetically, whether it's LLMs or providers. And that particular study that I'm thinking about, it was LLMs. So I think that there are different use cases that physicians versus LLMs are good at. The explaining things like informed consent and explaining disease. I actually think the LLMs might be better. But what physicians are better at are synthesizing certain data points. There was this amazing paper in Nature by Hager and his team that used LLMs, a variety of LLMs, to diagnose different types of abdominal pathology. And the LLMs did not do well. And I think it just went to show how much room there is for improvement. There's so much hype about generative AI and LLMs now, and there's some things that can be really good, but there are things that do not work well. And it becomes clear that as of now, there isn't a role for LLMs to replace physicians, and it kind of helps delineate what physicians are needed for versus what LLMs can do well.
Thank you very much. From
Mhm.
Daniel Lorenzati, amazing lecture, says there are no doubts about the potential of AI for disease identification and impact in management. But what about hard outcomes? Should we set a high bar for AI tools like we do for drugs or interventions? How is the FDA process for approval of these tools?
I love this question because I spend a lot of time thinking about this. Right now, the FDA approvals that you saw, the majority are 510(k) approvals, which means that what needs to be proven is just that the model does what it says it does. If it says it picks up aortic stenosis, it does do that. So that's all of what we were talking about in the beginning. On the other end, it's does everything need a clinical trial? If you think about the average clinical trial in cardiovascular disease, it takes on the order of years, sometimes over 10 years, it costs millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. There's no way we can do that for AI. What AI looks like 3 months ago is different than what it looks like now. If we do a full clinical trial for every AI tool, we're never actually going to see the benefits of it. I think there's something in between. And I think that that perspective evaluation it might look a little more like very robust post-surveillance monitoring. So really robust phase 4 diseases. You definitely need the phase 3 in some way, shape, or form. Some sort of perspective evaluation may be done on the order of months to max a year to understand outcomes, but then you need to monitor outcomes over time so you can test and see what's happening 5 years down the road. But the model you're going to be using during those 5 years is going to have evolved multiple times over. And then I think we also probably need to take a risk-based approach. An AI model that tells you some measurement on a CT scan that a radiologist can confirm, maybe you don't need a full clinical trial for that, versus something that's going to, lead to a decision about really intense therapy or something that could have patient safety risk. Maybe you need something more rigorous. So I really push against this idea that we need clinical trials in AI just like pharma and device, because I think it would lead us down a path that we don't want to go down. But rigorous prospective evaluation, yes, I think is essential.
Well, thank you very much. I learned a lot. This was a very exciting lecture. And so for everyone, you have your CME code there. And so we look forward to keep reading your papers and hopefully we'll see you at ACC.
Wonderful. See you there. I'll be there. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.